Down on her luck, Leah Joy Ward hopes to cash in on her charm.
This is my friend Leah.
Leah was attractive. She had a beautiful smile. She could hold conversation.
A trifecta of qualities that score her the ultimate fortune with handsome entrepreneur Ajaz Ahmad.
Okay.
He was a giving person. He would help anybody.
He had a need to be a husband. He had the need to be the head of a family.
Where have you been?
But in Leah, the divorced dad finds a fixer-upper beyond repair.
Get out of my way and leave me alone!
I knew right away that she was evil.
I knew it!
Leah Ward was not going to be dumped. She wasn't going to be cut out.
I thought that I was having a nightmare.
Oh my God!
And when I didn't wake up, that's what scared me even more.
When Ajaz Ahmad arrives in the United States from Pakistan in 1988, the 26-year-old has the American dream in his sights.
Ajaz Ahmad came over here, like most of our immigrants, trying to find a better life.
He had already obtained a bachelor's degree in engineering and arrives in Memphis because he's going to school for his second degree.
While enrolled at the University of Memphis, Ajaz picks up a variety of jobs. But the one thing eluding him most is love in his life.
It was important to him, as part of his faith, to be married and to be in a relationship.
That all changes in the spring of 1988, when Ajaz meets 22-year-old Spitfire, Bonnie Marsh.
My mom introduced me to Ajaz through one of his close mutual friends.
Would you like some sweet tea?
Yes, please. Thank you.
You could tell he was a nice person, that he had been reared right.
He walked in, he was very handsome. He had a sparkle in his eye, and I fell in love with him instantly. After our first initial meeting, we dated, had dinner, went to the movies, would talk on the phone all night long, laugh and giggled, and it was a very innocent relationship.
Then suddenly, after they dated for a while, I was working in the yard. They come up and wanted me to go with them to get married.
Today.
Well, congratulations. I was real happy because he really loved her.
In autumn of 1988, the two marry, and just over a year later, they welcome baby Jordan. Ajaz calls him Tariq, which means desert warrior.
Ajaz was an amazing father. He was very attentive, and I have never seen such love between a father and son as between Jordan and Ajaz.
But with Jordan's arrival, simmering tensions over the couple's religious differences become more pronounced. And when Jordan is only 3 years old, they amicably divorce.
He was not happy about my decision to stay Christian. And for Ajaz, it became all or nothing at that time.
Bonnie and Jordan move in with her mother, while Ajaz copes with the divorce by sinking himself into work.
Ajaz was kind of self-made. He bought houses, fixed them up, rented them out. He would get old cars, fix them, resell them for a profit. He made his own way.
By the time he's 40, Ajaz buys his own home in a suburb of Memphis. He shares custody of Jordan, now 10 years old, but he's forlorn without a wife. Then in September of 2002, one of his mechanics introduces him to a female friend, 26-year-old Leah Joy Ward.
Leah was attractive. She had blonde hair, she had a beautiful smile, she could hold conversation, she was an intelligent girl.
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, she was just hanging around the shop. She just got in from out of town.
But the mechanic explains she doesn't have a place to live, she's the mother of 2 children, she's hungry, and Ajaz is attracted to her personality but he also feels that he needs to help this woman.
Leah tells Ajaz her ex-husband has custody of their kids and that he kicked her out with just the clothes on her back.
Ajaz didn't want this woman to be out on the mean streets of Memphis by herself. He actually moved her into one of his rental homes, and he checked on her and made sure that she had the things that she needed.
Sure, as a Muslim, it's mine.
But the house is in an area of town that is not the safest or the best place.
Ajaz invites Leah to his home and makes her an even better offer.
I can move you to another house, or...
He says, I want you to take my home because it is in a better neighborhood.
Well, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Ajaz's faith prohibited him from living with a woman who is not his relative and who he is not legally married to.
The new arrangement forces Ajaz to move in with a friend, but it also invites more opportunities for the two to spend time together. And the topic of discussion is most often Leah.
She told him that because of family, of abusive men, of a horrible life, she just could not attain her dream.
Leah wants to become a nurse, and with Ajaz's support, her goal starts to feel real.
He had a need to be a husband. He had the need to be the head of a family. He loved the child that he had, and he wanted more children. So he thought he could help Leah and build a relationship out of that.
A few weeks after Leah moves in, Ajaz's former mother-in-law pays him an unannounced visit.
So good to see you.
She is disturbed by what she sees.
I went over there and she was laying on the couch. She got up and he introduced her.
If Ajaz is hoping for Tina's approval, he doesn't get it.
She wasn't very friendly. She said I was up all night and I was just getting some sleep. She was supposed to be in school and then I'm working with people on the side. My antennas went up that she wouldn't look you in the eyes. She didn't want you to ask her anything.
How's Jordan?
Oh, Jordan is fine, honey, and he misses you.
Ajaz seems oblivious to Tina's disapproval, and after a little over a month of knowing Leah, he proposes.
Right away, Leah agrees to the marriage, and she tells him she's very interested in his religion and she will convert.
Ajaz yearned for a Muslim woman to share the same values with him and to walk with him and to attend the mosque with him. I was happy for Ajaz that he finally found that passion that would hold him together with someone who believed the same way he did.
How are you?
Days later, Ajaz wants to surprise his 11-year-old son, Jordan, who has yet to meet Leah.
I was in 6th grade. My dad stopped by my school and wanted to get me out of school early, and he was really excited and he wanted to surprise me with something, but I didn't want to go.
Yeah, but you know, you don't want to miss this surprise. I'm telling you, you don't want to miss this. Can you come?
I don't think I can. It's just the most important test. I've been studying for it.
And I ended up not going with him.
The following day, Ajaz and Leah are married at a local mosque.
Leah looks beautiful. She's wearing the hijab. It's a lovely ceremony. Ajaz's best friend performs the ceremony, and there are these people in the mosque that do not know Leah. They've never met her, but they're happy for their friend Ajaz.
I found out later on that weekend that he had married Leah. I was actually really surprised.
Kabul.
Congratulations.
Jordan doesn't meet his new stepmother, Leah, until after the wedding.
My first impressions of her were pretty good. Leah seemed really charismatic and wanted to get to know me, and was really interested in our family, and she seemed really nice.
The following weekend, Leah's children, ages 4 and 6, come into town to visit.
Leah and my dad, they took me and her kids out to the park and to the store. Really anything that they did, they included us. She treated me like her kid. Overall, it seemed like she wanted to be a good stepmother.
Finally, it seems Ajaz has achieved it all.
They live in this nice house. Leah could pursue her educational goals. They could raise their 3 children together, and they would be a perfect couple.
But weeks into their marriage, the facade begins to crack.
I knew it.
And then out of nowhere, these rages would show up.
She scraped her fingers across the palm of my hand,
Charmed.
and a cold shiver immediately ran down my spine.
It is none of your business.
If she's willing to physically hit him, then what more is she willing to do?
When 40-year-old Ajaz Ahmad and 26-year-old Leah Ward marry, the newlyweds and their 3 children from previous marriages appear to become a happily blended family.
Now he had a wife and a female figure in his home for his son Jordan. She even volunteered to become a member of his mosque and started wearing a traditional Muslim-type clothing.
The next time Ajaz picks his son Jordan up from his ex-wife, he brings Leah with him to meet her.
But she never got out of the car. So I walked over to the car and extended my hand, and she reached out to the palm of my hand and scraped her fingers across.
Charmed.
I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I knew something was wrong. And I said, that woman is evil.
One thing is certain, Leah doesn't want anything to do with Bonnie or her mother, Tina.
I believe that Leah does not like the fact that Ajaz remains friends with Bonnie. And this angered Leah to no end. Why do you have to talk to her? Are you still seeing her? What's going on with you two? And Ajaz would try to explain. This is my ex-wife. We have a child together. We are still friends. I am still friends with that family.
Leah and I weren't physically around each other much, but we spoke on the phone quite frequently. And I would ask to speak to Ajaz. And she said, why is that? I simply stated, he is the father of my child. May I speak to him now? I'll let him know that you called as soon as he makes it back. Click.
Tell me where he is.
Hang up on me.
And Leah's jealous behavior isn't reserved just for Bonnie.
Leah became obsessed with Ajaz. She wants to know where he is. Who is he talking to? What is he doing?
Ajaz had dinner with a friend of his, a business associate actually, and that business associate brought his secretary with him.
I knew it.
Leah showed up from out of nowhere and stormed into the restaurant accusing him of having an affair with that woman.
He is mine.
Leah.
You just back off.
Well, this embarrasses Ajaz, and he excuses himself from the table. And his 2 friends, they had never met Leah, so they had no idea who she was or what she was doing.
Do not touch me.
Everybody was very concerned by the level of anger and hostility that she displayed.
What are you looking at?
He had no idea what to make of this. And Ajaz is starting to tell friends, this isn't the woman I married. This is not the relationship I thought it was going to be.
Hoping to avoid yet another fight, the couple agrees to spend their first Thanksgiving with Leah's parents and extended family.
Now, Ajaz loved holidays, and he loved Thanksgiving. And Leah decides, we're going to spend the holiday with my family.
But unexpectedly, among the invited guests is Leah's ex-husband, Larry.
Now, Larry and Ajaz have never met. Larry's bringing Leah's 2 kids.
Leah has only told Ajaz that Larry kicked her out of their home.
Ajaz walks over to Larry, extends his hand, introduces himself, and he said, "I hear you are mean." And Larry glances over at Leah and says, "Buddy, you don't know mean."
The unexpected comment catches Ajaz off guard, but he leaves it at that. The afternoon passes without further incident until Ajaz is sitting alone after dinner.
Leah's little daughter comes up to him and in a very sweet voice says, "Why did you marry my mommy? My mommy is still married to my daddy."
Given her age, Ajaz thinks the child may be confused.
What do you mean?
But it makes him wonder, could she be telling the truth? Is Leah a bigamist?
Ajaz is shocked by this, but he doesn't want to ruin the holiday for everybody. And so he sort of puts it away rather than confront Leah there.
As the Christmas holidays approach, Ajaz's focus on his businesses takes a back seat to his family's needs. As he reviews some financial statements, one of his accounts comes up short by $1,000.
So Ajaz confronts Leah and asks, where did this $1,000 go? And Leah explains very flippantly,
Christmas gifts for the kids.
$1,000 worth of gifts?
Do you want the kids to have Christmas or not?
Fine, I don't want to argue with you.
Ajaz isn't sure if he can believe her.
thus far, Ajaz has helped Leah. And because of who he was not one to mistrust. But now things are taking a turn, and he is starting to see Leah is not who he thought she was.
Once again, instead of causing a fight, Ajaz chooses to let the matter go. A few days later, Jordan is excited for an outing with Leah and his step-siblings.
She took me and her kids to the mall, and we were told that we could go into the mall and meet her at a certain time.
For 3 children, all under the age of 12, wandering alone in the mall proves overwhelming. They quickly return to the spot where Leah left them.
Before we even got back to the spot, she had called my dad and was saying that she couldn't find us and that we had run off.
Look, I don't know where they went. We're just in the mall.
She started fussing and getting ugly towards them, all 3. And she said, "You should have been here an hour ago." She didn't even know what time it was. And Jordan knew that she was wrong. Them other 2 kids didn't say anything. I think they were afraid of her.
It was kind of weird how she just would try and make up some lie to tell him to get us in trouble. Seemed like she had an ulterior motive at that point, but I couldn't understand why she wanted to get us.
Ajaz is equally perplexed by the situation.
He questioned her and said, well, why would you have even let them run off? You're there, you're supposed to be watching them. It didn't make sense to him.
I am tired of you getting on my case.
Little does Jordan know the incident at the mall is just the beginning of a nightmare he will never forget.
Leave me alone.
Evil can hide behind many faces.
What the hell are you doing?
He told me that Leah was capable of anything. And I said, what do you mean?
When Ajaz Ahmad and Leah Ward meet, they quickly get married. For both, the relationship is a second chance at all that love has to offer. But after a few months, Ajaz's 11-year-old son Jordan finds himself questioning what his dad sees in his new stepmother.
Me and my dad were at home and we were watching a movie. It was late at night and she came home and my dad simply asked her where she had been. He hadn't heard from her.
Leah would just disappear. She would be gone for hours, and she would never explain where she was.
Leah's reaction catches Jordan and Ajaz by surprise.
You know what, Ajaz? I am tired of you getting on my case.
She raised her voice at him, and they started arguing.
Stop being so controlling.
Leah.
She was not acting like herself, or what I thought was herself. She pounded her fists into his chest
Get out of my way. Leave me alone.
and stormed into the bedroom. It was very unexpected.
Leah appeared to just have absolute fits of rage anytime things didn't go her way. Her response was emotional, it was violent, and it was incredibly quick in its onset.
Now, Ajaz believes, and his religion says, never hurt a woman, so he is standing there with his hands up.
He never lashed out at Leah or struck her.
Seeing his stepmom's behavior concerns the 11-year-old Jordan.
When I heard that rage in her, I was kind of frightened. You know, if she's willing to physically hit him, then what more is she willing to do?
After only 5 months of marriage, the strain between the couple is becoming toxic, and everyone can see it.
The relationship is crumbling. Big cracks are starting to show. Ajaz is not taking care of himself. He is wearing clothes that are not ironed. His hair is messy. He's not washing it. And his eyes had lost that spark.
Seeing Ajaz, the bags under his eyes, his pale skin, the timbre of his voice, the essence of him was slowly dying inside. He was scared and did not know how to handle the situation.
Jordan was helping me clean up the backyard, and she came with Ajaz. I noticed she was just so nervous and doing her hands like this, and I noticed her fingernails were ragged looking, and I knew something was wrong. She might have been a pretty girl, but evil can hide behind many faces.
And just when he thinks it can't get any worse, it does.
A letter arrives, and it's from the Department of Corrections.
What is this?
Not any of your business. The notification comes from the federal parole board. They want to see Leah and have a parole hearing. Leah started getting in trouble with the drug trade and was arrested and prosecuted federally.
Leah, what is it?
All right, I'm just gonna come out and say it.
Leah has violated parole. Now she has to tell Ajaz. She's on parole. She spent time in prison, and it was for a drug charge.
What the hell for?
The news comes as a complete shock.
My dad didn't want to hide much from me. He told me that he had found out that she was on parole. That's probably one thing that he was pretty strict about, was no alcohol, no drugs of any kind. I think that she was on the road to recovery, so I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, but I was wondering how much more she was gonna lie about.
Ajaz confided in me that he married Leah too hastily. He found out things about Leah that were disturbing, and he didn't know what to do about it. When I found out about prison, drug use, checkered past, it scared me. So I knew why Ajaz was so fearful.
I think that he also wanted to make sure that I was protected. He felt like he had compromised me and my safety by just simply having her in the same household.
Excuse me?
You heard me.
Ajaz believes Leah is no longer trustworthy, but he is caught in a heart-wrenching quandary.
He didn't want another divorce. He didn't want to go through that heartbreak again, and he had become very close to her children. He didn't want to lose them.
All I can imagine is that he's weighing out the tenets of his religion and what his obligation is at this point.
By April of 2005, Ajaz's ex-wife Bonnie is also fearful for Jordan's safety, so she decides to do her own snooping around.
I followed Leah, sat in my car, and watched her get out of her vehicle and saw a strange man meet her. And I knew that she was up to no good. When Leah was with Ajaz, she would dress very conservatively and wear a hijab at the mosque. But this person I saw that night was dressed promiscuously.
Bonnie doesn't tell Ajaz about what she sees, but it reinforces her belief that her ex needs to leave his wife, and fast.
I told Ajaz to go stay with a friend for a week and give Leah the ultimatum to get her stuff out because that was his home.
My dad came to me and he told me some things had been going on with him and Leah, and he asked me if he should leave her. I told him, if you're not happy, then you need to leave her.
For all of Jordan's 11 years, very few days have gone by without some form of contact from his father, Ajaz.
My dad was my best friend. I spent a lot of time with my dad, and we talked almost every day, even when I wasn't there with him on the weekends.
So when several days pass without a word from his dad, Jordan is surprised.
I tried calling him, and it went straight to voicemail.
Jordan tries reaching him again. This time, it's Leah who answers the phone.
She said your daddy went to West Memphis, went to get some cars, because he bought used cars.
I called Leah back. I said, when will he be back? Click. I called again. I said, I need you to tell me where my son's father is. She said, you should have thought about that when you were married to him. He's not your problem anymore. Click.
She hung up.
I spoke to her multiple times over the phone, and each time she would tell me that he was at a further and further place.
Almost 3 weeks pass, and Jordan still can't reach his dad. He calls Ajaz's number again.
She told me that my dad had gone to Pakistan and he wouldn't be back for a month. I knew at that point that she was lying.
Give me the phone.
I said, you know what? I'm tired of you lying to me. He would always get in touch with Jordan if he were to leave the country. I was very angry.
At that point, I knew something was really wrong, and we needed to figure out what was really going on.
Bonnie decides to find out for herself what's going on. Without telling anyone, she heads over to Ajaz's house after work.
I walked up, looked inside the windows. All the furniture was gone. I knew that something terrible had happened. I was scared. Felt like somebody was watching me. And my first instinct was to run.
Bonnie hurries home and tells her mom, Tina, what she saw. The following day, Tina decides to drive over to Ajaz's house and take a look for herself.
I got home from school and my grandmother was about to leave. And I said, well, don't go by yourself, let me go with you.
We went over there and we looked through the windows and the house was wrecked.
There was no furniture and there were flies in the windowsill. What my mom was telling me at that moment was something bad had happened to my dad and we needed to get the police involved.
But before they leave, Jordan and Tina check the backyard.
As we were approaching the backyard, through the fence, we started smelling this really foul odor. It was the worst smell you could ever imagine. We walked into the backyard, and the closer we got to the shed, the worse the smell got.
Jordan went over there and he pushed the door to the side. And when we did, that's where the odor was coming from.
I saw an egg crate foam topper laying on the ground with a bulge in it. And I asked my grandmother to lift it up. And when she lifted it up,
I knew it was a body there.
Oh my God.
I let it down real quick, but Jordan saw some anyway. He said, "It's my daddy." I said, "You don't know that. We got to get out of here and call the police."
I thought for a moment I was having a nightmare and that I would wake up. And when I didn't wake up, that's what scared me even more.
I got Jordan out, and I said, "Go to the house across the street." And I asked the woman, could I call the police? I was so distraught, I couldn't even remember my name.
Moments later, police arrive on the scene.
The body was wrapped in plastic and hog-tied and drug into a storage shed with an egg crate mattress over it.
But the body is decomposed to a point it cannot be positively identified on the scene.
They started questioning me and my grandmother, trying to figure out who we were and asking what we think happened or who could have done this. And I couldn't remember my own name or where I lived. My mind was completely blank, and I was in shock.
I called Bonnie and I said, "Get over here. You have got to get Jordan. He don't need to be here."
Bonnie arranges for a relative to take Jordan home so she and her mother can remain on the scene as police continue their investigation.
The detective came over and I said, "It's Ajaz, isn't it?"
We haven't identified the victim yet.
She said, "When we do find out for sure, we will let you know." The detective called me the following morning.
The body is positively identified as Ajaz Ahmad.
His head had been cut off. There had been multiple attempts to sever his leg.
The police asked me, did I have any idea who would want to harm Ajaz? I said, absolutely. Leah.
My immediate thought was Leah. She was the one that probably did this.
Police just need to find her.
Leah Ward is nowhere to be found.
If they'd have just not found that body for a couple more days, she would have had the perfect alibi.
Following the gruesome discovery of Ajaz Ahmad's body in a backyard shed, all signs point to his wife Leah as the suspect.
I knew that she had killed my father. I told the police they needed to find out where she was.
3 days later, police locate Leah in federal custody.
Leah surfaces. She has self-reported to go back to prison to serve out 4 months because she violated her parole.
Investigators learn Leah had a previous conviction for drugs, a secret she had initially kept from Ajaz.
Leah is more than happy to talk to them because of her parole violation. And the officers explain, this is bigger than a parole violation. We need to speak to you about what happened with Ajaz Ahmad.
When police tell Leah about Ajaz, she breaks down and decides to confess.
She starts telling the officers that when Ajaz found out that she was on parole and she had violated her parole, he was so enraged that he just beat her and he hit her and he yelled and he screamed and he threatened her with her life. She said, I'd never seen him this angry. And when he stepped away from me, that's when I grabbed the gun. That's when I aimed it at him, and it was only to protect myself.
She said he was coming at her, he was going to attack her, and so she fired the pistol. and it struck him in the heart, and it killed him.
Leah admits to shooting Ajaz twice in the chest.
She said she let the body lay there for a couple days. She dragged it into the bathroom so that it wouldn't bleed on the hardwood floors, and she tried to get it in the bathtub, but that she couldn't physically do it. Insects had started gathering in his eyes and nostrils, so that's why she cut the head off.
Leah told investigators that she put the body on a piece of plastic, and then she dragged the body out to the front yard to put in the garbage can. But it was heavy, so she pulled it around to the back, and she placed him in the shed.
Leah claims she can't remember what she did with the murder weapon, and it's never found. But swords similar to those she used to dismember Ajaz are recovered in a storage locker she rents.
So Leah's saying that this was self-defense. But when the head's missing, there needs to be a little bit more of an explanation. This is somebody who has a lot of anger. This is very personal. And she said he busted the bedroom door down and was coming at her, and that's when she had to shoot him. She apparently didn't think the story out too much because the door jamb was clear that the door had not been broken in. There was no damage to the door or to the door jamb of any nature.
The DA's office charges Leah Joy Ward with first-degree murder. Pam Stark is assigned the case, her first as assistant DA.
There was absolutely no doubt in my mind after I looked at this case that Leah Ward was not going to be dumped. She wasn't going to be cut out. She wasn't going to be left. She didn't put any blame on herself. It was all on Ajaz.
Two years later, Leah's trial begins in Memphis. Bonnie, Tina, and 14-year-old Jordan are there.
She looked a lot different than when she was with my dad. She had cut her hair and dyed it, and she looked a lot older.
Leah sat at the table, very calm, very composed, as if she is just watching something that happened to somebody else and not to her. The defense stated that Leah was fighting for her life. Ajaz was incredibly abusive because he was Muslim, because he was from the Middle East. He was a very violent individual.
Stop yelling at me.
And he ruled his home with an iron fist.
The prosecution refutes every claim and shines a light on Leah's own behavior.
There was not a single person that had ever seen Ajaz so much as raise his voice or raise a hand or even push Leah away from him.
And prosecutors learn Leah had deceived Ajaz all along.
Leah had failed to tell Ajaz that she was still legally married to Larry.
They only had a Muslim ceremony. I don't know if Leah just said she wasn't concerned about having a marriage license or how that all worked out. There was no legal marriage in the state of Tennessee because they didn't get a marriage license.
Then, after the murder, the prosecution believes Ajaz's remains were still in his house as Leah emptied it over the next 2 weeks.
What we focused on was all the things she did afterwards. That's where it was clear to us that this showed premeditation. Leah couldn't have been in that house and not known that there was a decomposing body there. Not only was the smell permeating the storage shed that he was found in, but the entire house reeked of it.
And Leah wasn't done just yet. Ajaz's rental homes were broken into, and renters' property went missing. Tenants even received termination notices.
One would assume in an attempt to rent them herself so she could get money. Even after 2 weeks, never a time anywhere during that where she even had enough remorse to run away. The fact that she stayed and got every single dime that she could milk out of every single piece of property that Ajaz had showed this was a premeditated act.
Prosecutors believe when Leah turned herself into custody for her parole violations, she expected to spend a few months in prison and would be able to retrieve the items she'd left in the storage unit.
She had prepaid it. She thought that she could spend however long in jail there and then get out and do whatever she had planned on doing.
On November 4th, 2005, Leah Joy Ward is convicted for the first-degree murder of Ajaz Ahmad.
Leah Ward was sentenced automatically to life imprisonment. That is, in Tennessee, a minimum of 51 years.
I was really relieved that she wouldn't be able to do this to anybody else. As they read the verdict, she looked back at me and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I knew that she was sorry, but I don't believe it was for the right reason. I think she was more sorry for her having to spend the rest of her life in prison.
Ajaz, by all accounts, was an honest, caring, charitable human being. And Leah Ward took advantage of that. And then in the end, she tried to use both his Muslim faith and him being a man to change perceptions and get people to see her as the victim. These actions tell me that Leah Ward is the most cold-hearted, unfeeling person that I've ever dealt with.
Today, the anger is gone, but the wounds are still raw.
Yes, so we're gonna go.
I want people to know that Ajaz was the nicest man I've ever met in my life. He was a perfect gentleman all the time, and he was a loving person. And I will always remember him like that.
What I miss most about Ajaz is the way the rest of the world would stop existing. And that it was just me and him, and we could conquer anything together. That stays inside of my heart, and it helps me to focus on the positive energy.
October light can be the cruelest kind. It does not fall like winter light. Thin and apologetic, it arrives warm. Ordinary, almost generous. Touching parking lots, gas stations, sidewalks, school entrances, grocery store curbs, and the roofs of family cars with the calm assurance of another normal American day. In the fall of 2002, across Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, that light kept landing on scenes that, seconds later, would become nightmares. A man pushing a cart, a woman carrying bags, a teenager standing outside a school, someone filling a tank with gas before work, someone mowing grass, someone crossing a parking lot with nothing dramatic in mind beyond errands, schedules, traffic, dinner. The 100 forgettable obligations that make up a life, then a crack. Sometimes so sharp it seemed close, sometimes so strange and detached that witnesses could not at first make sense of it. Then a body folded into the asphalt or onto a sidewalk, or beside a car door left hanging open. Then confusion. Then screaming. Then the terrible silence that follows when a crowd realizes the danger has not passed. That whatever did this is not inside the victim, not beside the victim. Not even necessarily visible. It is somewhere out there. Watching. What made the Beltway Sniper murders so horrifying was not only the bloodshed, though there was plenty of that, and not only the death toll. Though 10 people would be killed and several more wounded, it was the methodical corruption of everyday life. This was terror stripped of spectacle and reduced to its most intimate form, the moment a person stepped into open air and became visible. The region did not feel as though it had wandered into a war zone. It felt as though war had learned how to dress itself as routine. Morning coffee still steamed in commuter cups. School buses still sighed at corners. Radio hosts still joked between songs. Parents still hurried children along the curb with lunchboxes and backpacks. Office workers still checked mirrors and traffic reports. People still stopped for gas. Groceries, hardware, dry cleaning. That was the point. The killers understood something primitive and devastating about modern suburban life. People trust patterns. They trust repetition. They trust the architecture of their own habits. A parking lot at mid-morning is supposed to be dull. A gas station at dusk is supposed to be inconvenient. Not fatal. A walk from a storefront to a car is supposed to be nothing at all. A blank span of existence so forgettable the mind does not even bother to keep it. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo turned that blank space into a chamber of dread. They did not storm buildings or issue warnings from podiums or choose scenes built for drama. They selected the places people are least offended by their imagination. They took the invisible moments, the little bridges between home and destination, and taught an entire region to fear them. At first, fear is always a little clumsy. It arrives in fragments. A local shooting appears on television, and viewers assume some hidden grudge lies beneath it. A murder in a parking lot sounds senseless, but many murders sound senseless until the details sort themselves out. Then another shooting comes, then another. The victims do not know one another. The locations do not settle into one neighborhood. The times do not form a simple pattern that ordinary people can avoid. The violence seems to drift. And that drifting quality is its own kind of menace. A fixed danger can be mapped. A moving one colonizes the imagination. Across the capital region, maps began to feel useless. Every road joined another road. Every suburb resembled another suburb. The broad ribbon of highways that tied D.C., Maryland, and Virginia together no longer suggested mobility and convenience. It suggested reach. Somewhere on those roads was a vehicle that could come and go without announcement. Somewhere was a person patient enough to aim, fire, disappear, and let panic do the rest. It is difficult, after the fact, to recreate the atmosphere of those weeks, unless one remembers how much of American life depends on the illusion of harmless distance. The suburbs around Washington were not isolated rural communities where every truck is recognized and every stranger noticed, nor were they compact urban blocks where danger feels proximate and visible. They were landscapes of in-between space, roads unfurling past shopping centers, schools tucked behind trees, brick homes with clipped lawns, chain stores, driveways, medians, playgrounds, church lots, commuter arteries. The distances were small enough for a killer to move quickly and large enough for witnesses to be uncertain. People saw flashes, shapes, fragments of movement, but not certainty. That uncertainty spread faster than facts. It moved through office buildings and kitchens, through school pickup lines and police briefings, through television crawls and whispered workplace conversations. People began glancing over their shoulders while pumping gas. Some crouched beside their cars, some zigzagged through parking lots, embarrassed by the absurdity until embarrassment itself was swallowed by survival instinct. Parents ran with children through open spaces. Schools canceled outdoor activities. Businesses looked out at their own lots as though they had suddenly become fields under enemy observation. Every open space acquired a crosshair, whether one was actually there or not. And that was the genius of the terror, if such a word can be used for anything so morally vacant. The shots did not merely kill, they trained. Each attack instructed millions of people how to be afraid. A gas pump was no longer a machine. It was exposure. A sidewalk was no longer a path. It was a firing lane. A crisp autumn afternoon was no longer pleasant. It was too bright, too open, too easy to see across. The body learns these lessons quickly. Shoulders rise, steps hurry. Eyes scan tree lines, parked vans, service roads, gaps between buildings. The mind begins to calculate angles without meaning to. That invisible labor exhausted the region. It was not fear in occasional bursts. It was fear as a constant low electrical current under the skin, and the killings kept coming. Adults who had spent years teaching children not to panic found themselves unable to explain what safety meant. How do you reassure the child when you do not understand the rules yourself? Stay close to the building. Move quickly. Keep your head down. Do not linger outside. Advice once reserved for storms or rare urban emergencies became part of ordinary suburban instruction. The ground beneath daily life shifted. Children absorbed the tension with the eerie precision children always have. They watched the adults. They saw the way parents scanned parking lots, the way teachers hesitated before outdoor transitions, the way television coverage swallowed the house at night. A whole region began performing defensive rituals without fully believing those rituals would work. That, too, is part of terror, the ceremony of control in the presence of helplessness. In those weeks, police cruisers multiplied. Helicopters thudded overhead, investigators flooded scenes, and reporters spoke in urgent voices from medians and storefronts. Yet the central emotional truth remained the same. The shooter chose the moment. The shooter chose the place. The shooter understood that modern life cannot completely shut down. People must still buy food. They must still leave work. They must still stand beside their vehicles. They must still exist in public, however briefly. The killers fed on that inevitability. To understand the fear, one must also understand the setting. The Washington region in 2002 was not merely politically important. It was psychologically symbolic. This was the nation's capital and its surrounding web of federal workers, military personnel, contractors, immigrants, teachers, students, shop clerks, laborers, parents, retirees, people from everywhere who had built a life in its orbit. The area already lived with the afterimage of national trauma. A little more than a year had passed since September 11th. Americans were still learning how vulnerability could inhabit ordinary mornings. Security language had entered daily speech. Suspicion had become easier to trigger. Against that backdrop, the sniper attacks landed with amplified force. The public did not interpret them as isolated crimes. They felt like a continuation of a historical unease, a proof that danger had not receded but changed form. This time, it did not arrive through hijacked planes or spectacular images broadcast around the world. It arrived alone, in a single bullet crossing an unnoticed distance. There was something almost obscene in the contrast. The leaves were beginning to turn. School days went on. Halloween decorations appeared on porches. Seasonal sales filled storefronts, and into that deeply familiar American autumn scene came one of the purest campaigns of domestic dread in modern criminal history. No thunderstorm announced it. No visible pursuer gave chase. People simply dropped where they stood. The cruelty of randomness is that it does not wound one victim at a time. It bruises the logic by which everybody else lives. If the dead had shared a profession, a neighborhood, a feud, a social circle, then at least the public mind could frame the violence as bounded. But randomness mocked that desire. The victims differed in age, race, gender, occupation, routine. They were linked only by circumstance and visibility, by being in the wrong place at a moment two predators had chosen. That randomness did not mean the killers were chaotic. On the contrary, the shootings reflected mobility, patience, planning, and an appetite for domination. The random appearance was itself part of the design. It widened the psychological blast radius. It told the public there was no profile of safety except perhaps not leaving home at all, and even that assurance felt thin. Yet home is never enough when life must be lived. Groceries run out. Children need schooling. Cars need fuel. Jobs require attendance. The architecture of modern adulthood depends on stepping outside repeatedly. And every one of those steps now carried an extra thought. Some later remembered feeling watched even in empty lots. Some remembered the sound of leaves scraping pavement or the click of a gas nozzle locking into place, and how strangely loud such sounds became when the mind was listening for a rifle shot. The environment itself seemed to conspire with dread. Open medians looked longer. Tree lines seemed less decorative and more strategic. White work vans, box trucks, sedans pulled oddly near curbs, all drew suspicion. One could not look at an ordinary vehicle without wondering whether it had been transformed into concealment. Normal objects became suspicious by association. That is how terror colonizes a landscape, not by changing the objects themselves, but by infecting the meanings attached to them. A school entrance becomes a possible line of fire. A parking space becomes a vulnerable pause. A stand of trees becomes a blind. The region was not merely frightened, it was retranslated, even before the names John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were firmly fixed in public consciousness. The attacks were already writing themselves into memory as something colder than rage and more methodical than impulse. There are crimes of passion that explode and burn out. There are crimes of greed that can at least be understood within the ugly arithmetic of money. This felt different. This felt like people being used as pieces in a demonstration whose message was simple: we can reach you anywhere. That message lodged deep because it humiliated the public imagination. Most people move through the world believing that danger announces itself somehow through context, through time of day, through neighborhood, through visible tension, through the familiar warning signs adults collect over a lifetime. The Beltway Sniper murders denied all of that. Daylight was no shield. Family neighborhoods were no shield. Ordinary errands were no shield. Innocence of purpose was no shield. If anything, the more mundane the act, the more terrible the interruption. There is a peculiar horror in the unfinished gesture. A hand still near the gas pump. A shopping trip halted between trunk and driver's seat. A body fallen where the heartbeat earlier there had been only motion toward the next small task. These were not theatrical scenes. They were interrupted sentences. And each interruption sent a message beyond the victim to millions who saw themselves in that same posture, that same errand, that same open patch of pavement. It is easy, years later, to focus on the mechanics of the case. The rifle, the vehicle, the route, the forensic breakthroughs, the manhunt, the names and dates. Those matter. They will matter more as this story unfolds. But before the investigation, before the suspect's sketches and false leads and feverish police coordination, there was a simpler and more devastating reality. A region woke each day unsure whether ordinary life would be punished again. That uncertainty changed behavior, conversation, posture, even time itself. Days felt stretched thin, each new report slicing the calendar into before and after. People did not merely watch the news, they waited inside it. They learned the geography of violence the way people learn weather patterns. Except weather is indifferent, and this was intentional. Somewhere, moving through the same roads everyone else used, were two human beings who had chosen to convert anonymity into a weapon. They did not need to shout. They did not need to be seen. Their power came from withholding themselves while forcing their presence into the minds of strangers, and so the autumn deepened under a cloud no satellite image could detect. The capital region carried on because it had to, but every errand now contained an argument between necessity and instinct. Go to work or stay home. Stop for gas now or later. Let the kids walk from the car or run them inside. Stand upright or crouch. Linger for conversation or keep moving. Those are small decisions, the kind people usually make without noticing. During the sniper attacks, each one felt newly consequential, as though survival might hinge on some tiny bodily choice no one had ever had to make before. This is where the story truly begins, not at the moment of arrest, nor even at the moment investigators finally understood the shape of the threat, but here, in the soft domestic surface of an American October as it began to crack, in the sound of television anchors speaking too carefully, in the tension around school doors, in the parking lots where people suddenly ran, in the way the air itself seemed to turn against the exposed human body, somewhere beyond the sight line. Muhammad and Malvo were preparing, moving, selecting, watching. The public did not yet fully know their names, but it already knew their intention. They wanted strangers to feel hunted. They wanted routine to feel fragile. They wanted the region to understand that safety was not a place, but a belief, and beliefs can be shot through. Before the first shot froze a parking lot into a crime scene, before parents began hurrying children through open spaces with their shoulders tight and their eyes flicking toward tree lines, before gas stations became places of private calculation and public dread, there was a world around the Beltway Sniper case that made the terror hit harder than numbers alone can explain. Part of the reason the murders lodged so deeply in the American mind was that they did not erupt into an empty landscape. They entered a region already carrying strain, suspicion, and a special kind of civic fatigue. Washington, D.C., and the broad ring of communities in Maryland and Virginia around it had always lived with layered identities. It was the symbolic heart of American government, a place crowded with monuments, bureaucracies, embassies, military offices, commuters, and security routines. But it was also something far more ordinary and far more human than the television image of the Capitol. It was a patchwork of suburbs where people bought mulch and cereal, argued about traffic, rushed to after-school pickups, cut grass on the weekend, stopped for fast food, and tried to build stable lives in the shadow of institutions much larger than themselves. The region was full of people who had learned to treat large historical forces as background noise. Elections came and went. Security alerts rose and fell. Officials talked. The highways filled. The school week kept moving. Ordinary life in the capital region had a practiced ability to absorb the grand theater of the nation and continue with the much smaller theater of domestic routine. But in 2002, that ordinary resilience was already fraying around the edges. The country was little more than a year removed from the attacks of September 11th. The atmosphere in and around Washington still held the aftertaste of shock. Not always loud, not always visible, but present in posture, in conversation, in the architecture of concern. People had become accustomed to hearing phrases like threat level and homeland security, accustomed to the sight of tighter police presence, accustomed to living with the idea that an ordinary morning could split open without warning. That does something to a city and its suburbs. It does something quieter than panic, but more lasting. It lowers the threshold at which anxiety begins. It makes people more alert, but not necessarily wiser. It teaches them that danger can be real even when it feels improbable. And when the sniper killings began, that emotional groundwork mattered. The public did not receive the violence in a neutral state. It received it in a region already trained by recent history to imagine the unthinkable. Yet the case also drew its terrible strength from a contradiction. Washington was a place dense with security culture. Intelligence agencies, law enforcement networks, cameras, patrols, protocols, and highly educated professionals whose daily work revolved around risk assessment. If there was anywhere in the country that should have seemed protected by competence and vigilance, it was the capital region. And still, day after day, people fell in parking lots and beside their cars and outside schools. The contrast was humiliating in a way that made the fear sharper. It is one thing to believe danger lurks in the shadows of neglect. It is another to realize it can move efficiently through one of the most monitored regions in the nation. The suburbs surrounding Washington were not built to imagine themselves as hunting grounds. They were built to offer the middle-distance promise of modern American life. Not the compressed urgency of downtown streets, and not the remoteness of rural isolation, but a life of driveways, strip malls, office parks, school entrances, chain restaurants, soccer practices, church lots, cul-de-sacs, and long commutes softened by routine. These were landscapes organized around the car and around the assumption that mobility meant freedom. Families chose neighborhoods based on school districts, yard size, manageable crime rates, access to highways, and the small domestic calculations that shape adulthood. The roads around the Beltway did not merely connect places, they structured time, work, parenting, shopping, and identity. One town blurred into another. A person could live in Maryland, work in the district, shop in Virginia, and think of the entire region as a single circulatory system. That interconnection is one reason the sniper attacks spread fear so efficiently. The violence did not belong to one neighborhood that others could mentally quarantine. It traveled the same network everyone used. Every commuter understood, instinctively, that the geography of the crimes was also the geography of their own life. The attacks unfolded in an environment defined by repetition. Morning departures, lunch breaks, errands after work, school drop-offs, weekend chores, hardware store runs, quick stops for gas. All of it depended on predictability. Predictability is the invisible luxury of peace. People rarely recognize how much they rely on it until something begins to poison it. In the weeks before the killers were identified, that poison spread through the most repetitive aspects of suburban existence. Men and women who had stepped out of their cars thousands of times without a second thought suddenly felt exposed in the space between the driver's seat and the store entrance. Parents who had once urged children not to dawdle now found themselves almost physically propelling them across open pavement. School administrators, accustomed to worrying about buses, absences, weather, and discipline, now had to think in terms of sightlines and outdoor vulnerability. Even those who were never physically near a crime scene began to experience the region differently. A wide parking lot seemed too wide. A grassy median seemed less decorative and more like cover. A stand of trees no longer read as autumn scenery, but as concealment. The context of the case was therefore not only historical or geographic, it was psychological. It was about how a place loses its innocence in increments. When people imagine terror, they often imagine exceptional spaces, airports, government buildings, famous landmarks, dark alleys, dangerous blocks, places already coded by drama. The sniper attacks chose the opposite terrain. They struck in spaces so unremarkable that the mind normally slides past them. That choice was not incidental. It was the central logic of the terror. The killers did not just want to kill. They wanted to contaminate the background of daily life. In that sense, the context of the Beltway Sniper case includes the entire suburban architecture of ordinary motion: asphalt, painted lines, cart returns, pump handles, car doors, sidewalks, school walls, grocery bags, lawn mowers. All the objects and surfaces that, under normal circumstances, disappear into routine suddenly became charged with fear because they were the last things victims touched. It is difficult to overstate how much the random-looking nature of the attacks unsettled social trust. American life depends on categories, even when people do not say so aloud. We divide violence into domestic disputes, gang retaliation, robbery, workplace rage, personal grievance, ideological attack. Those categories do not lessen tragedy, but they reassure the broader public that the violence has contours, that it belongs to a chain of causes most people are not in. The Beltway Sniper murders seemed, at first and for too long, to mock that framework. The victims did not present an obvious common thread. They were different ages, different races, different genders, different occupations, different routines. They looked like the public itself in all its ordinary variety. That meant almost anyone could imagine themselves in the victim's place without stretching the imagination at all. Not because the killings were philosophically random, but because they appeared socially unbounded. One day it was a person doing yard work. Another day it was someone outside a store. Another day a student, another day a commuter. Nothing in the visible pattern allowed the public to say safely, that kind of person, in that kind of situation, in that kind of place. And once that sentence becomes impossible, fear begins to democratize. It moves across class, race, neighborhood, profession, and age with startling efficiency. Another important part of the context lies in the media environment of 2002. This was an era close enough to the present to feel modern and yet distant enough that the flow of information had a different texture. Cable news was relentless. Local news coverage was intense. Radio remained influential in cars and kitchens. The internet existed as a major force, but it had not yet become the fully immersive social media ecosystem that now turns every crisis into an instant ocean of rumor. Video, meme, counterclaim, and amateur sleuthing. Information moved fast enough to saturate a region, yet slowly enough that uncertainty had room to breathe. That gap between report and certainty proved fertile ground for dread. Each new shooting entered a public atmosphere already thick with speculation. Witness descriptions circulated, vehicle rumors spread. Sketches were discussed, police statements were parsed for reassurance and for hidden alarm. People sat in offices refreshing news pages, listened to updates while merging across highways, watched television at night and tried to extract order from incomplete briefings. The case became not only a criminal investigation, but a public ritual of suspense in which millions were involuntary participants. Every report of a new shooting did more than add another victim. It revised the map of fear. It told people the danger was still mobile, still unsolved, still ahead of them rather than behind them. The law enforcement response, massive and urgent though it was, also became part of the context because it revealed how difficult it is to chase an adversary who understands mobility, patience, and psychological leverage. Police agencies across jurisdictions had to coordinate under intense scrutiny while the shootings continued. The crimes crossed borders that mattered administratively but not emotionally. To the public, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia formed one threatened region. To investigators, each shooting scene carried local procedures, separate departments, chains of command, reporting structures, and practical complications. Coordination had to be built in real time under the pressure of an invisible moving target. That challenge fed public unease. The more authorities appeared everywhere, the more startling it became that the killer or killers remained unseen. Police tape multiplied. Cruisers clustered. Tactical units appeared. Helicopters beat the air. Yet the next shooting still came. The contrast between visible response and invisible offender gave the case an almost ghostly quality in the public mind. It made the assailants seem larger than they were, more omnipresent, more cunning, almost mythic in the ugliest possible way. Another layer of context was the emotional economy of fall itself. Autumn in the mid-Atlantic carries a texture that matters here. The air sharpens. Light falls at a lower angle. Leaves begin to bronze and redden. School has settled back into rhythm. Families are no longer in summer's loose drift, and not yet in the hard closings of winter. It is a season of errands and routines reestablished, of football games, Halloween decorations, raked yards, jackets pulled from closets. Grocery runs before dark comes earlier. There is something deeply domestic about it. That domestic quality made the sniper attacks feel like an intrusion not simply into public safety, but into the seasonal script of American family life. The violence did not arrive in a moment already coded as dangerous. It arrived amid pumpkins on porches, school activities, and the quiet fatigue of parents managing ordinary weeks. A murder beside a gas pump in October sunlight carries a different emotional sting than violence in a setting already marked by nightlife, criminal underworlds, or obvious chaos. It profanes the ordinary. It stains the season itself. For many who lived through those weeks, the memory of that autumn did not separate cleanly into headlines and home life. The headlines seeped into home life until the two became inseparable. Even the case's eventual notoriety should be understood within this context of public imagination. The phrase Beltway Sniper condensed the complexity into a title the media could repeat. And the repetition did what such phrases always do. It transformed an unfolding human horror into a cultural symbol. But the symbol did not begin in the newsroom. It began in the public's need to name what felt otherwise shapeless. Naming a threat gives the illusion of containing it. Yet in this case, the name was also a confession of helplessness. It emphasized the one feature ordinary people found most haunting: distance. A sniper is terrifying not only because of marksmanship, but because of the relationship between victim and assailant. The victim does not see, negotiate with, or even properly register the person inflicting harm. The violence arrives across space. It turns visibility into vulnerability. In the suburban landscapes around Washington, that idea hit with peculiar force because those landscapes are full of open transitional spaces. They are designed for short exposures repeated endlessly throughout the week. One walks from house to car, car to store, store to car, car to office, office to parking lot to school entrance. The case made people aware of those transitions in a way they had never been before. It exposed the fragility built into convenience. The context also includes the men at the center of it, though their full story belongs later. Even before their names were permanently welded to the murders, the eventual shape of the case would reveal a chilling asymmetry. An older man, John Allen Muhammad, and a younger accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo, moving through the region with a blend of discipline, resentment, fantasy, and predation that turned private pathology into public menace. That interpersonal dynamic matters because the crimes were not simply abstract acts of marksmanship. They emerged from a human relationship shaped by domination and influence, by a poisonous bond that allowed grievance and delusion to harden into a campaign of terror. The context of the murders is therefore not only the social world they struck, but the psychological world from which they came. A killer does not materialize from nowhere. He brings his obsessions, his failures, his hungers for control. He brings his ability to recruit, manipulate, and rationalize. In this case, that inner corruption would spill into the lives of strangers who had never heard the names of the men choosing them. Yet, while later accounts naturally focus on the perpetrators, it is important to linger on the region they entered because that region is what made the attacks feel like an assault on civilian existence itself. This was not a battlefield, it was a commute. It was a shopping run, it was after school. It was a parent at a gas station, a worker in a parking lot, a person mowing a lawn under a clear sky. The context of the Beltway Sniper case is the terrible mismatch between the scale of fear and the smallness of the moments in which it was inflicted. There was no spectacle equal to the panic. That mismatch made the panic harder to discharge. People could not look at a giant ruined structure and say, "There is where the disaster happened." The disaster happened anywhere. An ordinary person paused in the open. That everywhere and nowhere quality altered not just behavior but social mood. Conversations became clipped, practical, cautious. Co-workers asked each other whether they had heard about the latest shooting in voices that carried both fascination and dread. Neighbors who once chatted idly outdoors became more aware of how exposed they were standing at the edge of a driveway. Parents measured the distance from car door to school entrance with a new, involuntary seriousness. This is the deeper context of Part 2. A region built on routine, carrying post-September 11 nerves, threaded together by roads and suburbs, saturated by media coverage, and suddenly forced to see its own everyday geography as vulnerable terrain. When the first killings occurred, they did not create fear from nothing. They ignited material already lying dry across the public imagination. They struck a place where millions of lives overlapped through habit and motion, where safety had long been assumed to reside in repetition, and where the shattering of that assumption would be felt not just as grief for the dead, but as a private wound to everyone still living. The capital region was not merely the backdrop to the murders. It was part of the story's anatomy. Its roads gave the killer's reach, Its routines gave them targets. Its recent history gave the fear extra voltage. Its ordinary spaces gave the violence its obscene intimacy, and as the days moved forward, as more blood darkened pavement and more sirens braided through the autumn air, the people of Washington, Maryland, and Virginia began to understand that they were not just witnessing a sequence of crimes. They were living inside a new kind of uncertainty, one that sat down beside them in traffic, followed them into parking lots, and waited with them under the thin, bright light of fall. What the victims said, in the deepest sense, was not spoken into a microphone or written across a police form. It was carried in lunch receipts, car keys, work uniforms, pharmacy bags, school notebooks, half-finished errands, and the ordinary forward motion of people who believed the day ahead belonged to them. A true crime story can become cruel without meaning to when it lets the killers grow too large and the dead too small, when the mechanics of terror begin to overshadow the people whose absence made that terror real. The Beltway Sniper murders were not frightening merely because shots were fired from a distance. They were frightening because each bullet crossed into a life already in progress. Each victim had risen that morning into a pattern built over years. Each had preferences, obligations, familiar roads, private stresses, small satisfactions, unfinished plans. The public first encountered them as locations and ages, as brief updates breaking into weather reports and commuter traffic coverage. But before they were headlines, they were the most intimate kind of evidence. Proof that ordinary life was being hunted. Their statement was not theatrical. It was not dramatic in the way television likes drama. It was the statement of human routine. And because routine is so modest, because it rarely announces its own value, the violence done to it felt especially obscene when the first victims entered the national consciousness. They did not do so as symbols. They entered as fragments. A person in a parking lot, a shooting near a store, a body found beside a car, a life reduced in the first awful hours to location, circumstance, wound, time of day. That is how violent crime often appears at first. Stripped down to bare logistics because logistics are easier to say aloud than grief, yet behind every brief report stood a whole architecture of living. One victim had left home expecting to return. Another had set out to buy groceries, to fill a tank, to step through one more necessary task on an ordinary day. Another had likely thought of nothing larger than the next hour. That is part of what their lives were saying to the world. Though no one recognized it until it was too late, we are here in the open because this is what ordinary people do. We work, we shop, we walk to our cars, we mow our grass. We stand still for a moment under the sky and trust that the sky will not answer back with violence. The region came to know the victims first through fear. But fear is a selfish emotion. It centers the living and asks what danger means for them. The harder, more honest work is to move backward from that fear into the lives that generated it. Consider how humble the scenes were. Not secret meetings, not dangerous deals, not dramatic confrontations, but errands. The final movements of the victims were often so small they would have been forgotten by evening if they had ended normally. A stop at a store, a walk across asphalt, a pause outside a building. That humility matters. It is easy for the public to mourn grandly when a life is lost in some visibly consequential setting, but these murders demanded a different kind of moral attention. They required the public to acknowledge that an unremarkable afternoon is not disposable just because it is common. The dead were not valuable because their endings were spectacular. They were valuable because they were alive in ordinary ways, and ordinary ways are where most human meaning resides. The victim's statement, then, began long before the shots. It began in the shape of their days. A man's way of holding a steering wheel after years of habit, a woman's mental list of what still needed to be picked up from the store. The rhythm with which a parent calculates time between work and home, the half-conscious planning that accompanies every adult errand. We move through those motions so often that we mistake them for blankness, but they are not blank. They are thick with character. One person lingers to compare prices. Another moves briskly and efficiently. One likes to top off the gas tank before it gets too low. Another puts it off until the light comes on. One calls home from the car. Another drives in silence. One notices the weather. Another notices only the traffic. These are not trivialities. They are the signature of being alive. When violence interrupts them, the interruption tells us something about the victim precisely because it catches them mid-pattern. It reveals what kind of day they believed they were living. In the sniper case, that revelation became agonizingly repetitive. The victims kept appearing in the middle of modest, practical acts. The effect was cumulative. The public was not only hearing that people were being killed, it was learning that people were being killed while performing the basic grammar of adulthood. That is why the victim's statement can be felt even where words are absent. Their dead bodies, collapsed in places meant for errands and transit, testified to what had been stolen, the right to inhabit public routine without becoming prey. Yet some voices did survive in a more literal sense, and even there the emotional truth was not melodrama but shock. Survivors of sudden public violence often speak first in sensory fragments, a sound that did not make sense. The feeling of being hit before understanding what had happened, the strange delay between the body knowing and the mind catching up. Witnesses, too, tend to remember confusion before they remember fear. A person falls. Someone thinks it might be a medical emergency. Someone hears a noise but cannot place it. People look for an attacker nearby because human beings expect violence to come with a visible source. In the sniper attacks, that expectation kept failing. Victims and witnesses were denied even the crude clarity of confrontation. There was no face advancing, no shouted threat, no visible rage to interpret. The violence arrived already detached from its author. That meant the victim's last statement to the world was often made through posture and collapse rather than speech. They were walking, then they were down. They were standing, then they were gone. It left loved ones, investigators, and strangers to do the work of speaking for them, to reconstruct the ordinary dignity of their lives from the routines violence had cut through. Families always carry a second version of a victim, one the public never fully sees. The news can tell you age, occupation, hometown, maybe a smiling photograph. But families know the private weather of a person. They know who wakes slowly and who springs out of bed. They know whose jokes land badly but are told anyway. They know which child still calls by an old nickname, which parent worries too much, which sibling drives too fast, which grandparent keeps candy in a kitchen drawer for no good reason except affection. When the sniper victims were named and their lives began to emerge in fuller outline, the region had to confront the gap between the crime scene image and the human being. A body on pavement is a fact. A human life is accumulation. It is years of preference, memory, labor, tenderness, irritation, habit, regret, and hope. The victim's statement lives inside that accumulation. Even those who never heard their names before the murders recognized something unbearable in the details once those details surfaced. Here was a parent. Here was a worker. Here was a student. Here was somebody doing what countless others had done that same day. The public did not only mourn the individuals, it mourned the collapse of the assumption that such individuals could continue being themselves in public without attracting a killer's interest. There is another reason this section matters. In a case dominated by randomness, the victims became the only stable moral center. The killers moved, concealed themselves, manipulated attention, and sought to turn the region's imagination toward them. The victims did the opposite. They restored proportion. They reminded everyone that the story was not about cleverness, it was about theft. Not only the theft of life, but the theft of continuity. The dead could no longer finish the day they had started. They could no longer return phone calls, unload groceries, pick up children, finish shifts, complain about traffic, ask what was for dinner, put gas in the car, and drive home under ordinary evening light. Those unfinished acts are a kind of statement, too. They show us the moral violence of interruption. Every homicide is an interruption, but the sniper murders made interruption visible in especially brutal ways because the victims were so plainly in the middle of daily transition. Their belongings remained near them. Their cars remained where they had parked them. Their tasks remained suspended in open view. The scene itself spoke. This life was moving forward 1 second ago. Another truth sits beneath all of this. Victims often become symbols against their will, in public fear. The first victim becomes the warning. The next becomes evidence of escalation. Another becomes the reason schools change procedures. Another becomes the face shown while officials urge caution. The individuality of the dead risks being swallowed by the function they serve in the public story. That happened here. Inevitably, the victims became markers in a spreading map of terror. But to write this part honestly is to resist that flattening. The victims were not important because their deaths helped the region understand the scale of the threat. The threat was important because it annihilated people who should have been free to remain unremarkable to everyone except those who loved them. There is a profound cruelty in being killed by a stranger who knows nothing about you except your visibility. The victims did not die because of a personal conflict, a betrayal, a long feud, a reckless choice, or any mutual history. They died because they occupied space at a chosen moment. That kind of death strips away narrative comfort. It leaves loved ones with no argument to finish, no motive to wrestle into comprehension, no obvious moral geometry. Their statement, then, is not one of explanation but of innocence. They did not summon this. They were not moving toward drama. They were living. One of the most haunting elements of the case is how it taught the public to study victims backward. The moment a new shooting was reported, people began imagining the final errand. Why was the person there? Had they come from work? Were they on the way home? Had they nearly finished what they needed to do? Had someone been expecting them? Was there food thawing on a kitchen counter? A child waiting at school? A spouse wondering why the delay? A message that would never be answered. This backward study was not idle curiosity. It was empathy under stress. The public kept tracing those final movements because it recognized itself in them. That is the larger social statement the victims made. They exposed how deeply connected strangers can feel when a murder takes place inside a familiar pattern. Not everyone knew the names at first, but everyone knew the errands. Everyone knew the parking lots, the gas stations, the stop on the way home. The little exposure between destination and vehicle. The victims' lives stood before the region as mirrors. And that mirroring is why the fear expanded so quickly. It is also why the grief did not remain abstract. Even people untouched by direct loss felt it at some private level, that a boundary around daily life had been pierced on behalf of them all. Survivors and witnesses carried their own form of testimony. The living who were wounded or who saw bodies fall were forced into an altered relationship with space, chance, and memory. They had entered a parking lot as ordinary citizens and left it as repositories of horror. Such people often find that the mind replays the final normal second more than the violent second itself. The step before the sound, the hand on the car door, the thought about something entirely unrelated. The body remembers not only pain, but betrayal, the sense that the world changed its rules without warning. That sense radiates outward through families. A spouse may spend years imagining the final minute. A child may remember not just the loss, but the public atmosphere around it, the news, the fear, the way adults started moving differently. Trauma speaks through behavior long after language fails. In that way, the victim's statement did not end with the dead or the injured. It continued in the changed lives around them, in households forced to absorb absence under the glare of a national manhunt. And still, through all this, there remains a quieter statement, perhaps the most important one. The victims insisted on the dignity of the ordinary simply by having been ordinary people. Their last hours were not built for legend. They did not know they were walking into history. They were doing what life required. That matters because history often has a vulgar appetite for the dramatic. It prefers singular personalities. Apocalyptic imagery, monstrous masterminds. But most suffering enters the world through interruption of the plane. The Beltway Sniper case is unforgettable not only because the killers were mobile and calculating, but because the victims remind us how much of human life unfolds in undefended spaces. A civilization is measured partly by whether people can move through those spaces without terror. These victims, by the mere fact of how they were living before they were killed, testified to what civilized life is supposed to allow. When that allowance was shattered, their deaths became more than individual losses. They became a wound in the public idea of normality. So Part 3, the victim's statement, must be heard in two registers at once. In the first register, there is silence. The brutal silence of lives stopped mid-errand, mid-motion, mid-afternoon. In the second, there is an immense human murmur made of family memory, witness confusion, survivor pain, interrupted routine, and public recognition. Together, those registers say something plain and devastating. The people who died were not abstract casualties in a puzzle for police to solve. They were men and women and young people standing inside the ordinary world, carrying its mundane burdens and invisible hopes. When violence selected them for no reason they could have anticipated, they speak now through everything they were on the verge of doing next. Through the groceries not put away, through the drive not completed, through the household expectations that outlived them by minutes and then by years, through the millions who looked at their stories and understood, with a shiver that entered the bones, that the dead had been doing nothing more extraordinary than living the same public life everyone else had always trusted. It did not begin with a single thunderclap that told the region exactly what it was facing. That is one of the reasons the Beltway Sniper case became so psychologically corrosive. The incident, in its true unfolding, did not arrive in a form that people could immediately recognize and name. It came in scattered eruptions, each one sharp, brief, and terrifyingly clean, as if violence itself had learned how to travel light. A body on pavement, a gunshot no one could quite place. A crowd that first hesitated, then scattered. Sirens moving toward places that, only minutes earlier, had been scenes of ordinary suburban life in the beginning. The incident was not yet a legend, not yet the defining phrase that would soon flash across television screens and settle into the national memory. It was a sequence of moments in which ordinary time snapped. A person stepped from a car, or stood near a storefront, or paused in the open air. And then something invisible crossed the distance between the hidden and the exposed. In those first seconds, confusion was often stronger than fear, because fear at least assumes that the mind has understood what has happened. But the people at these scenes frequently had not. They heard a crack, or something like a crack, sometimes mistaken for construction noise. A backfire, a falling object, some random mechanical sound of the modern world. Then they saw someone collapse. The brain, so dependent on cause and effect, so desperate to connect sight to source, began looking in the wrong places. Nearby bushes, a neighboring car, a doorway, another person on foot. Human beings are trained by instinct to imagine danger as local. Someone lunges. Someone shouts. Someone runs. The incident denied all of that. There was no visible confrontation. No shouted warning, no trembling buildup. Death and injury arrived with the impersonal speed of a bullet and left behind the humiliating fact that the killer had been present without being seen. The incident, then, was not just the shootings themselves. It was also the rupture of expectation that followed each one. People did not merely witness violence. They witnessed the collapse of their own assumptions about how violence behaves. The region would learn that lesson again and again through October 2002. But at first it came as a kind of sensory betrayal. One moment there was the autumn light pooling in a parking lot or stretching across the edge of a roadside. The next, there was screaming, blood. People falling to their knees beside a stranger, the sudden urgency of hands pressing at wounds. And everywhere, the same bewildered question shaping itself in different mouths. Where did it come from? That question mattered because it dictated everything afterward, if the shooter had been close. Then perhaps people could run from him, point him out, chase him, describe him. If the shooter had been visible, then the incident would have belonged to a recognizable category of crime. But the source of the violence remained detached from the scene, and that detachment turned every victim into part of a larger theater the public could feel but not yet see. The region did not understand, in the earliest moments, that it was witnessing the work of a pair of killers using distance as both tactic and psychological instrument. It only knew that the usual chain between attack and attacker had been broken. To tell Part 4 honestly means entering the incidents at ground level, where there were no headlines yet. No grand theory, only sharp interruptions in ordinary life. Imagine a morning or an afternoon that feels so banal the mind barely records it. A person leaves home with a list. Another turns into a lot and finds a space. Another pushes open a car door. Another stands beneath an open sky, perhaps already half thinking about what comes next. Dinner, work, homework, bills, traffic, the little inconveniences that make up the fabric of adulthood. Then the sound comes, and with it, the grotesque compression of time that all sudden violence creates. The body drops faster than understanding can follow. Witnesses rush forward or freeze in place. A stranger becomes a center of gravity. Someone screams for help. Someone dials 911 with hands that do not feel fully attached to the body anymore. Someone crouches instinctively, not yet knowing why crouching seems wise, only feeling the animal instruction to get lower, to shrink, to stop being so visible under all that open air. The incident unfolds in those layers. There is the bullet itself, the physical act, mercilessly direct. Then the human reaction, ragged and confused. Then the spreading awareness that whatever did this is still somewhere nearby, not in a room that can be sealed off. Not on foot where eyes might catch him, but in the wider unseen. That third layer was what made the case metastasize from murder into regional terror, because after the first few shootings, every new incident carried with it the memory of the previous ones. People no longer arrived at scenes innocent. They arrived preconditioned by dread. The next victim did not fall into a vacuum. He or she fell into a region already beginning to understand that these attacks were linked by more than bad luck. The incidents developed rhythm. And that rhythm was itself a weapon. A shooting in one place would ignite emergency response. Media attention, speculation, police deployment. Then another would occur elsewhere, as if to mock the idea that concentration of force in one zone could protect the next. The killers exploited geography with cruel intelligence. D.C., Maryland, and Virginia were not isolated theaters, but one intertwined suburban sprawl, laced together by roads that made movement easy for ordinary commuters and, as it turned out, for predators. The incidents could bloom in one county and then in another, leaving behind the afterimage of reach. Each shooting did not merely add to a body count, it revised the emotional map of the region. It told people that no single neighborhood owned the danger and no simple avoidance strategy could neutralize it. One of the ugliest features of the incidents was how little spectacle they required. The killers did not need dramatic entrances. They did not need chases or barricades or long confrontations broadcast live. They needed only a target in the open, a stable firing position, a controlled shot, and a route away. The simplicity of that formula made it feel almost impossible to defend against. A society can imagine ways to harden spectacular targets. It can post guards, install barriers, restrict access, check bags, search vehicles, but how does one harden the space between a supermarket and a parking lot? How does one fortify a suburban gas station without turning all public life into a military exercise? The incidents forced that question onto a region whose infrastructure had never been designed for this kind of threat. And because the threat struck so briefly and disappeared so cleanly, each scene carried a maddening disproportion between consequence and visible action. The victim bled. The paramedics arrived. Police taped off the area. Reporters gathered. But the actual act had occupied only an instant. It was almost indecently efficient. There is something especially chilling about violence that wastes no motion. It leaves the living with a lot of chaos and almost no narrative to hold onto. They do not remember an argument or a chase. They remember normality breaking all at once. As the incidents accumulated, the region began to recognize their shared anatomy. A person alone or functionally alone in an exposed outdoor space, a sudden shot, a collapse, a lack of visible attacker. Yet even this pattern offered less comfort than one might think, because a pattern is only reassuring if it teaches avoidance. Here, the pattern taught only vulnerability. Avoid being outside alone, perhaps. But life in the suburbs is built around precisely that kind of exposure. People pump gas alone. They walk from work to their cars alone. They unload groceries alone. They cut grass alone. They cross school entrances alone or in loose clusters. The incident did not prey on reckless, exceptional behavior. It preyed on the architecture of ordinary independence. That is why the first practical responses often looked so strange. People zigzagged across parking lots. Parents sprinted children from car to doorway. Drivers crouched absurdly while filling tanks. School officials altered arrival procedures. The region was improvising rituals against a form of danger it barely understood. Because each incident had made the rules of public space feel newly unstable for the victims themselves. The incident was brutal in its lack of warning. Most likely none of them experienced the full shape of the terror that would later surround their deaths. They did not know they were entering one chapter in a sequence that would paralyze the capital region. They knew only whatever the body knew at impact. Pain, shock, collapse, or perhaps, in the worst cases, nothing coherent at all. That discrepancy between the personal and public scale of the incident is part of what makes the case so haunting. For the victim, it was the destruction of an individual day. For the region, it became a lesson repeated until it rewired public behavior. The same bullet that ended one person's future also altered how millions of others moved through their afternoons. The incident spread outward like ripples from a stone, except these ripples did not fade. They intensified with each new strike, and through it all, the perpetrators remained largely abstract, which gave the incidents a quality that bordered on the mythic in the public imagination. Witnesses described vehicles, glimpsed shapes, reported impressions, but certainty remained elusive. Rumor rushed to fill the void. White vans became symbols of suspicion. Every odd vehicle near a scene acquired narrative weight. Every parked car, every person lingering too long, every patch of concealment began to look as though it might hide the answer. This was one of the killer's great advantages in the incident phase. They understood that each shot would generate not only forensic evidence, but atmospheric confusion. The chaos after the bullet was part of the weapon system. The public's inability to attach the crime to a face or a fixed location made the incidents feel more expansive than they physically were. The whole region began scanning itself. It is important, 2. To understand the pacing of the incidents. The shootings did not simply happen. They happened against the clock of public anticipation. After one attack, the region waited. It listened. It watched the news. It told itself that police must surely be closing in, that the sheer intensity of the response would produce a break. Then another person fell. Hope curdled into dread. That cycle repeated with brutal effect. Every uneventful day carried a question mark. Every new incident answered it in the worst possible way. The waiting between shootings became part of the incident itself, because terror is not only what happens when the shot is fired. It is what happens in the hours when no shot is fired and everyone knows one might be coming. The body cannot sustain that kind of alertness without consequence. People became tired in a way that was not simply physical. They were spending emotional energy on vigilance, on tiny decisions about exposure, on the constant low-grade scanning of surroundings. Then, an incident would occur, and all that stored-up tension would spike into fresh panic. The case was writing itself into muscle memory across 3 jurisdictions. Meanwhile, law enforcement raced to impose coherence on the incidents, but the killer's method resisted quick narrative. A scene would be secured, shell casings sought, witness statements collected, angles studied, trajectories considered, timelines built. Yet for the public, what mattered most remained terribly simple. Someone had been alive in public one moment and dead the next. The technical work of investigation was vital, but it ran parallel to a more primitive social experience, the realization that exposure itself had become frightening. Investigators needed connections. The public needed permission to believe the nightmare had limits. The incidents kept postponing that permission. One can feel the emotional contour of these days in the changing behavior around places that, only weeks earlier, had meant almost nothing. Gas stations became tense, little theaters of speed. People no longer strolled through parking lots. They darted, hunched, glanced upward or toward tree lines without really knowing why upward seemed relevant. Outdoor school life was reorganized. Events were reconsidered. Businesses looked out at their own lots as if they had suddenly discovered they were responsible for fields of vulnerability. And every time the shot came again, it carried more than ballistic force. It carried confirmation. Yes. This is still happening. Yes. Nowhere simple has been made safe. Yes. Ordinary errands remain exposed. The incident phase of the Beltway Sniper case was therefore not just a prelude to the investigation. It was the transformation of public space into a site of private calculation. People began running statistical fantasies in their heads without admitting it. Maybe mornings are safer. Maybe crowded places are safer. Maybe staying near walls helps. Maybe moving faster helps. Maybe not going out after dark helps. Yet the incidents kept undermining these little bargains. The public was trying to negotiate with randomness, and randomness, or what appeared to be randomness, does not bargain. That helplessness deepened the horror. If danger has a face, people imagine ways to read it. If danger has a motive, people imagine ways not to provoke it. But when danger seems to choose strangers for reasons invisible to them, every person becomes stuck with a terrible freedom, the freedom to imagine themselves as next. That imagination is exhausting because it never reaches certainty, only possibility. And possibility, repeated enough, can dominate daily life as thoroughly as fact. In this way, the incidents taught the region a new bodily language. Head down. Move quickly. Do not linger. Stay near the building. Watch the open spaces. Listen for sounds that might already be too late. The body learned before the mind had fully processed the story. It learned from repetition, from news footage, from parental anxiety, from workplace conversations, from the sight of someone else crossing a parking lot at a near run. The capital region was not simply informed about the incidents. It was trained by them, looking back now. When the names John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo carry the weight of certainty, it is tempting to read the incidents as if they were always part of a coherent script leading inevitably toward capture. But for the people inside those days, the incident felt more like intrusion than plot. It arrived, vanished, and left the living to gather themselves under the pressure of not knowing when or where it would arrive next. That uncertainty gave each shooting an afterlife. The bullet ended in a body or in pavement, but the incident kept traveling. Through television broadcasts, school memos, office chatter, police briefings, and family conversations at dinner tables where appetite had thinned, the region inhaled each new attack and carried it around in the bloodstream. So Part 4, the incident, is not only the chronology of people being shot, it is the story of how a method of violence entered a modern suburban ecosystem and taught it to distrust itself. It is the story of normal seconds becoming historical seconds without warning. It is the story of how the seemingly blank spaces of everyday life, gas stations, sidewalks, lots, medians, school approaches, became charged with mortal significance. And it is the story of a region slowly realizing that what it faced was not a burst of local bloodshed that would explain itself by nightfall, but a campaign of predatory patience. The victims were struck one by one, but the incident belonged to everyone who had to keep stepping outside afterward. That is what made it so severe, so memorable, so corrosive. The shots were brief. The terror they installed was continuous. The first clue was absence. Not the absence left by a victim who should have stood up and gone on with the day, though that absence would come to haunt families and strangers alike, but the absence of anything the human mind expects to find at a crime scene. No attacker standing over the body. No frantic footsteps vanishing around a corner. No dropped weapon glinting in the grass. No trembling witness able to point and say there, he ran that way. What police officers, paramedics, store employees, commuters, and horrified bystanders encountered in those early Beltway Sniper scenes was something far more unnerving, the aftermath of violence without its visible source. A person lay bleeding on pavement beneath the indifferent clarity of an autumn sky, and the space around that body seemed almost offensively normal. Cars remained parked in clean-painted lines, shopping carts sat nested in corrals. Gas pumps hummed, a few leaves moved in the breeze. The ordinary environment had not been smashed or disturbed in the dramatic way people imagine after a shooting. It had merely been punctured. That quiet was one of the first reasons the crime scenes felt wrong. They looked less like explosions of rage than like carefully selected experiments in fear. Places where the killers had tested how little disorder was needed to create enormous terror. In a more familiar kind of homicide, the scene begins talking almost immediately. It tells investigators about proximity, struggle, direction. Sequence: broken glass suggests entry. Defensive wounds suggest confrontation. A trail of blood suggests movement. A discarded knife or casing in plain sight suggests haste or panic. The Beltway Sniper scene seemed, at first glance, to say almost nothing. The victims were often alone or briefly isolated in open public spaces. The wound came from a distance. The killer remained beyond the natural perimeter of the scene. That meant the usual geometry of violent crime had been stretched. A patch of asphalt beside a car was no longer just a patch of asphalt beside a car. It was the endpoint of an invisible line extending outward into a much larger environment. Beyond storefronts, medians, trees, parked vehicles, and roadways, into a field of possible firing positions. The crime scene did not end where the yellow tape was placed. Psychologically, it seemed to spread in every direction. That was one of the earliest and most destabilizing clues investigators and the public had to absorb. Whatever had happened here had not happened only here. The wound on the victim's body was local. The act that created it belonged to a wider landscape. You can feel the tension of those first responses almost viscerally. Patrol officers arrive. Someone is down. Dispatch calls are still fragmentary, shaped by panic and incomprehension. Maybe a shooting, maybe a medical emergency. Maybe an accident, maybe a man collapsed near his car. Then the body is assessed. There is blood. There is a wound. The truth begins to harden. This was no natural collapse. This was targeted violence. But targeted by whom? From where? With what? Those questions were not abstract. They were immediate and potentially life-preserving, because if the shooter had fired from concealment nearby, he could still be there, still watching. perhaps even preparing another shot. The early responders entered not just a crime scene, but a tactical uncertainty. Every tree line became a possibility. Every parked vehicle at the edge of a lot became suspicious. Every rooftop, fence gap, embankment, and patch of brush had to be considered not aesthetically, but ballistically. The region would grow used to that grim transformation of perspective, but at first it was profoundly disorienting. Public spaces that had been designed for convenience suddenly had to be read like terrain. The clues, when they existed, were often small enough to seem almost insulting compared to the scale of the terror. A single spent casing, a trajectory estimate, a wound path, a witness who heard a crack but saw nothing, someone who thought a white truck had been nearby, someone else certain it was a van, another person who remembered only confusion and the scream that followed. There is a special frustration in crimes where the emotional magnitude is enormous, but the physical evidence initially feels sparse or scattered. It is as if the scene is withholding proportion. People wanted something commensurate with their fear, some obvious sign that the world had been meaningfully interrupted. Instead, there were these minimalist fragments. A body in daylight, a wound from a distance. A region forced to learn that a single, well-placed bullet could create a crime scene outwardly calmer than many fender benders and inwardly more terrifying than open chaos. The initial clues were also shaped by the killer's method. And method is everything in forensic storytelling. These were not close-range attacks erupting from personal confrontation. These were standoff killings, designed to preserve the killer's invisibility while maximizing uncertainty. A sniper-style assault does more than complicate witness testimony. It deforms the idea of scene integrity itself. In a close-contact murder, investigators can often assume that victim and offender briefly shared a defined space. Here, the offender's space and the victim's space were radically separated. That separation meant law enforcement had to imagine the crime as a corridor rather than a point. Angle mattered. Distance mattered. Lines of sight mattered. The topography of parking lots and roadsides, the placement of curbs and trees and medians, the elevation of nearby shoulders, the orientation of vehicles. All of it became part of a grim spatial puzzle, and because the shootings occurred in functional public environments rather than remote wilderness or sealed buildings, those spaces were messy with innocent human traces. Tire marks did not necessarily matter. Footprints could belong to dozens of bystanders. Vehicle descriptions blurred together because public lots are built precisely to contain many interchangeable cars. The killers had chosen environments in which normality itself produced camouflage. That, too, was an initial clue. Though more psychological than physical, whoever was doing this understood not just marksmanship and mobility, but the anonymity afforded by suburban design. The scenes reflected an intelligence that did not need sophistication in the cinematic sense. It needed patience, observation, and a cold appreciation for how people move through ordinary infrastructure. Witnesses contributed what they could, but witness memory under sudden terror is a fragile instrument. A sound remembered too late, a person recalling that the victim simply crumpled. Someone else certain the noise came from one direction, though echoes in open commercial areas can trick the ear. Another witness describing a vehicle that, under pressure, becomes less a memory than a category. White van, box truck, sedan. Something parked oddly, something moving away. Early public fixation on certain vehicles, especially the specter of the white van, reveals how badly the collective imagination wanted a container for the fear. The clue did not have to be reliable at first. It had to be graspable. A visible suspicious vehicle was easier to fear than an unseen rifleman hidden within the bland flow of traffic. Yet that very instinct risked muddying the early investigative picture. False certainty can be as dangerous as ignorance when police are under enormous public pressure to act. The crime scenes therefore contained not only physical clues, but social distortions. Rumor sediment, media urgency. Frightened inference, the natural human tendency to give shape to the shapeless before evidence is ready. Even the victims' bodies became, in these early scenes, a form of evidence that was both precise and heartbreakingly limited. The location of the wound, the angle of entry, the damage inflicted. All of it helped narrow the story the bullet could tell. Firearms evidence is unemotional in one sense. It describes paths, velocity, metal, spin, caliber, trajectory. Yet in these cases, the cold precision of ballistic thinking sat beside the emotional obscenity of how the victims had been living seconds earlier. One had been pumping gas, another crossing a lot, another engaged in some completely defenseless act of routine. The body told investigators what the bullet had done. The environment told them what it had interrupted. That combination made the scenes unusually haunting. The forensic facts were hard and technical. The human context around them was soft with familiarity. This was not violence entering an already dangerous theater. It was violence staining places built for errands, school transitions, and household maintenance. As more scenes accumulated, the initial clues began to gain power through repetition. One strange shooting can remain ambiguous for a time. Several, across jurisdictions, begin to talk to one another. The similarities in wound patterns, the lack of visible assailant, the use of distance, the choice of exposed public settings, all these features started to align into something larger than coincidence. Separate scenes became chapters in one methodology. The clues were no longer only what could be picked up from asphalt or extracted from tissue, they were what persisted across episodes. Consistency itself became evidence. The randomness of victim selection existed alongside an eerie discipline in execution. That paradox was one of the key initial clues pointing toward a mobile predator or predators with a coherent operating logic. They appeared to choose victims who were available rather than personally connected. Yet they repeatedly chose environments that offered concealment, visibility, and escape. Their seeming randomness lived inside a methodical frame. That is often the signature of offenders who want psychological domination more than personal grievance. The early crime scenes, when read together, hinted at that hunger long before the public fully understood it. Then there was the question of communication, both literal and implied. Crime scenes can communicate unintentionally through pattern, but in this case there were also signs. As the investigation deepened, that the perpetrators wanted to be felt not merely as hidden shooters but as authors of public anxiety. Even before the extortion elements and messages entered the case more fully, the shootings themselves functioned like notes pinned to the region's consciousness. Each scene said the same terrible thing in a slightly different dialect of suburbia. We can reach into ordinary life and remove someone at will. The very lack of close physical confrontation became part of that communication. It emphasized superiority, invisibility, and contempt. The offenders were not merely killing, they were staging helplessness. The initial clues in that sense were moral as much as forensic. They suggested a perpetrator interested in disproportion, in causing social effects beyond the individual victim. Investigators may phrase such insights more carefully. But the pattern was there. This was not the heat of sudden anger. It was the cold theater of control. The crime scene dynamics themselves became part of the public trauma. Once people understood that the first moments after a shot involved not only medical emergency, but bewildering uncertainty about where the shooter might be, every future scene felt contaminated by a second danger. Not only could you be shot, you might not even know from where. The first responders embodied that fear in a professional form. They had to move toward the wounded while also considering that the terrain might still be lethal. This introduced a tactical caution that, though necessary, added to the atmosphere of horror. Imagine kneeling beside a dying person while knowing that the person who caused this may still have you in view. The crime scenes were not only places of evidence recovery, they were stages on which courage and vulnerability collided under awful conditions. That reality deepened the public's sense that these attacks were different. They were not only murders. They were ambushes against the basic confidence with which people imagine help will arrive. In the Beltway Sniper case, even rescue had to enter under a shadow. Another crucial clue lay in the mobility implied by the scenes. The killings occurred across a region stitched together by major roads, feeder routes, commercial strips, and suburban shortcuts. That geographic spread argued against a stationary offender acting purely from local familiarity with one block or business. It suggested movement, planning, and the use of a vehicle as more than transportation. A vehicle in such crimes becomes an extension of the offender's body. It stores the weapon, conceals the shooter, shortens the interval between attack and disappearance, and allows one jurisdiction's panic to become another jurisdiction's problem within the hour. Investigators knew that the road network around Washington was both curse and clue. It allowed escape, but it also implied that the offenders were relying on routine traffic patterns and blending into the most ordinary stream of suburban motion. The initial scenes, when mapped, began to whisper of reach. Reach is terrifying because it denies the comforting illusion that danger belongs elsewhere. Reach turns the whole region into a single nervous system. The victims' final locations mattered enormously, but so did their relation to roads, ramps, parking access points, and possible observation positions. Geography itself became evidence. The landscape was no longer background. It was an accomplice, or at least a medium. Media coverage inevitably pressed itself onto the forensic reality. Cameras near the tape, reporters speaking urgently against the banal backdrop of shopping centers and gas stations, public officials trying to reassure without overpromising. All this formed a second scene layered over the first. The actual evidence might be a casing, a wound path, a shell trajectory, but the mediated evidence absorbed by the public was something else. An image of open space made threatening. This mattered because it fed back into witness perception and public tips. Fear sharpened attention, but not always accuracy. People noticed more, but they also interpreted more. The abundance of tips could be a gift and a burden. Somewhere in the flood might be the one observation that mattered. Somewhere else were 1,000 projections born of panic. That is the curse of high-profile investigations. The crime scene radiates outward into imagination, and imagination creates debris of its own. Investigators must sift not only physical evidence, but narrative noise. All the while, the deeper clue remained the same. These scenes had been engineered to be almost indecently efficient. Little exposure for the shooter, maximum vulnerability for the victim, minimal immediate trace beyond the wound, and whatever ballistic breadcrumbs could be recovered. The restraint of the physical scene was itself revealing. Offenders who enjoy spectacle often leave chaos behind them. Offenders who seek domination through stealth leave absence, precision, and an enlarged perimeter of fear. The Beltway Sniper scene spoke in that second language. Even when police did not yet possess the whole grammar, they were hearing its rhythm. Something methodical was moving through the region, something that preferred control over frenzy, distance over contact, invisibility over confrontation. That understanding did not solve the case, but it shaped the emotional and investigative reality of every new scene that followed. By the time the region had fully absorbed that these were connected attacks, the crime scenes had already begun altering behavior far beyond the tape. People learned to read open air differently. They associated broad parking lots with exposure, roadside landscaping with concealment, the simple act of walking to a car with measurable risk. In that sense, the initial clues spilled out of police reports and into public posture. A clue is anything that points toward understanding, and here understanding arrived as a terrible practical truth. The killer was using the everyday environment as a weapon. The scenes proved it over and over. The very normality of the locations was not incidental, but central. That was perhaps the darkest clue of all, because it implied that safety could not be restored merely by avoiding unusual places. The threat had embedded itself in the architecture of ordinary life. So Part 5, the crime scene and initial clues, lives in this tension between scarcity and significance. There was often very little to see in the sensational sense. No dramatic confrontation frozen in debris, no obvious villain caught in the frame. Instead, there were bodies, wounds, Casings, trajectories. Witness fragments, traffic patterns. Maps, angles. And the oppressive feeling that the scene extended beyond itself into unseen terrain. Yet from those spare and chilling components emerged the first real silhouette of the nightmare. A hidden shooter, careful selection of exposed victims. Escape through mobility, a region-spanning method. An offender, or offenders who understood that terror grows best not from noise, but from silence pierced at exactly the right moment. Each crime scene looked, at first glance, almost too ordinary to carry the weight of the horror it contained. But that was the clue. Ordinary was the chosen stage. Ordinary was the camouflage. Ordinary was what had been turned against the public, and on the pavement, under the tape, in the wound channels and the widening maps spread across police desks. The truth was beginning to gather its shape.